All right. Now I would like to introduce our third panelist before we have the discussion, and that's Dr. Jennifer Malin. And Dr. Malin works as Vice President of Clinical Strategy at Anthem Health Group. Notably, she has led and kind of led the group, essentially, that put in the cancer care quality pathways at Anthem, which I know has been in the press lately, and I think you're going to talk a little bit about that. I also have to reveal that I think, Jen, you're probably a hometown favorite, right? being a clinical professor of medicine at UCLA, but also having graduated from Harvard and then upgrading to a doctorate here at UCLA as well. So 2 doctorates from UCLA. So it's great to have you here. And again, Jen will share a very, I think, different perspective from the folks who have to pay for all this healthcare. And I do sympathize with that because healthcare is
well, we're all paying for it. So we're the administrator of the payer, of all of us paying for it. I also want to disclose that I've worn many hats in the healthcare system over the years, and in fact have worked with every single one of the gentlemen on the panel at one point or another, including reporting up into Martin at one point when I worked at Amgen. So I share lots of different perspectives here. Are my slides up? Do I just hit it down? Okay. And in addition to having the perspective of a payer, I'm also still a practicing oncologist. So I'm probably the one person up here who also still has direct patient contact and deals with these things kind of. I do it as a volunteer at the VA, so it's not my day job, but it is something that I'm, very much, still in the aware of. So I want to kind of come back to some of the themes in terms of, again, focusing on drugs, since that was kind of, part of our stated goal here, and looking at, what we've talked about, what Martin's talked about, lots of innovation in the past decade or two, which has been really terrific, and then, the cost of drugs and different perspectives on it. So this graph here on the left is actually from Memorial Sloan Kettering from Dr. Peter Bach, and the good news is you see a lot more blue dots on the right than you do on the left. I won't wander as much, which shows that there have been lots of new therapies approved by the FDA. We have lots more treatment options for patients. That's all good news. The challenge, I think, that we face is the rising cost of these therapies, and what's unusual about this graph is it's actually a log scale. So every decade, we've seen the cost of an average month of therapy increase tenfold. So in 2010, the average cost of a new cancer drug coming to the market was about $10,000 per month. And if we continue on the same trajectory that we've been on the last, 3 or 4 decades, then by 2020, a new cancer drug will cost us about $100,000 a month for therapy. So, I think despite whatever the value is, most of us would probably, agree that that's probably not a sustainable rise when you think of the median family income in the United States, and that 1 in 3 of us are going to get cancer in our lifetime. It's probably not likely that we're going to be able to afford therapies for everyone that are $100,000 a month. So something to keep in mind. The graphs on the right were from a study published last year in JAMA Oncology. And, they tried to look at, these researchers tried to get a sense of, are we really, and this is the question that Darius raised, are we really paying for more to companies that are coming up with more value? Is the price of the drug associated with the benefit? And so on the x-axis here, you see on the top is progression-free survival, which is one way of measuring the benefit of a cancer drug. And graph B below, the x-axis is overall survival. And then you see the price of the drug on the y-axis. And there's a slight linear trend there. The R-squared, I think, is 0.13 and 0.16. So it's not like there's no relationship at all, but it's pretty much a scatter plot. So, if you think of it, from, I guess, an economist standpoint or rewarding the innovators, the system is not necessarily rewarding the best therapies with the highest price. And then, looking at Anthem data, where are, there's always, drug companies are always, why are you picking on us? Why don't you pick on anyone else? And to be fair, we're here today to talk about drugs, but we have lots of programs at Anthem that pick on all the other aspects of healthcare. So we're not just focused on the cost of drugs. We're concerned globally about how much premiums are going to go up next year and how we're going to be able to keep it affordable for people. But when we look at the cost of treating patients with cancer, and this is the pie chart on the right here, or on my left, I guess, you're right. And this is for members in active treatment for cancer. So there's lots of different ways to slice the data, right? You could look at people who might have gotten diagnosed with cancer but didn't. So that's one bucket of claims for cancer. You can look at the people who got treated for their cancer and still get follow-up every couple of years but don't have cancer anymore. So we take those people out because that's not really who you're thinking about when you're thinking about people with cancer getting treatment. So if you just focus on those members in Anthem, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, with cancer in active therapy, cancer drugs represent a third of their cost, of all of our costs, whether they're getting surgery, radiation, chemo, or any combination thereof, it's a third of the cost. So, and you can see it's the single largest cost, right, out of all those, out of hospitalizations, out of surgery. And so it is a big concern for us, and it's one of the reasons that we think about it. On the right-hand side, my right, your left, you can see kind of the issue of, one of the aspects that's unusual about the way we reimburse cancer therapy in the United States is that generally speaking, the doctors and hospitals who are administering the drugs purchase the drugs and then bill the insurance companies after the fact, or bill Medicare after the fact. So it's one thing, people say, well, why are insurance companies paying for this? Why don't you negotiate with drug companies? Well, it's because the system isn't set up for us to pay for it directly, and we don't negotiate with the drug companies over price. Basically, we pay the doctors and hospitals who deliver the care to the patients. And the system that's been set up to do that is basically we generally pay the average sales price of a drug plus some margin. So CMS started this system for Medicare around 2005. Previously there were other ways of paying for it, but now CMS pays average sales price plus 6%, although that's now been reduced by deductions to about 4%. And private payers do essentially the same thing. It's kind of the standard rack rate for private payers is around average sales price plus 6% to 10%, and then individual providers may negotiate higher rates. And you can see that practices are very dependent on that income. That's largely how we fund cancer care in this country, is off of that margin. So any system that's going to try to get practices and hospitals to be more value conscious and to use less expensive therapies is going to have to take into account that that's going to decrease their operating budget, and they're not going to be able to provide the same level of care. So how do we encourage them to be more value conscious but still provide the same level of care for patients? So let's see, kind of what we did. I'm going to talk a little bit about our program. It's called the Cancer Care Quality Program, and it puts in place cancer treatment pathways. If you look at national guidelines like the NCCN guidelines, they're very, very broad and inclusive. So NCCN includes 64 different treatment options that would all be guideline concordant for lung cancer for people who don't have mutations, so already a pretty select population. If you look at the 6 most common regimens that are used in the United States, you can see the estimated survival from kind of pivotal studies for these ranges from about 10.4 months to 13.4 months. The confidence intervals basically, though, all overlap a year. So, if you were to look at this, put this in front of patients, is there really much difference in survival? And no, the curves don't look different. The tails of the curves, unfortunately, don't look different for these different therapies. Toxicities aren't that different, but you can see that there's a huge difference in cost from $450 from the first therapy to $65,000 for carbopemetrexed bevacizumab, the last row. Under the best case scenarios, adding Bev, which is Avastin, the pivotal trials, not shown up here, but best case scenarios, it adds about a month of life. And you can see it adds somewhere between $40,000 to $60,000 for that month of life. So even going by what Darius's studies would show us, that probably puts it, if you were to assume that was a month of life in perfect health, which we all know it isn't, that's somewhere probably between around $800,000 to $1.5 million per QALY. So probably not cost effective, even according to the kind of value assessments that Darius's studies have shown patients make. So in our approach, we developed this cancer care quality program. We have treatment pathways where basically we basically do a very broad evidence review. The pathways are published on the web. Anyone can access them. You can request the lit reviews if you want. There are these evidence summary tables where all the studies for each of the regimens are pulled in, efficacy, toxicity, and then lastly, cost. We have external advisors who are oncologists who help us do this. And then we have, out of those 64 different treatment regimens for lung cancer from NCCN, and the 6 that you saw on that table, we narrow it down to the 4 in that particular case that have the best efficacy and are the most cost effective. And those then make it onto Anthem's pathway. Oncologists, when they select a treatment regimen that's on a pathway, then are able to bill an additional $350 a month for care coordination and treatment planning to offset the loss of income that they would face by having a lower profit margin on a less expensive regimen. So the system's designed to basically support the oncologist in moving into a more value-conscious framework and thinking about the value of the treatments that they select for patients. This is the impact from the practices standpoint. So if you look at these bar graphs, basically, the yellow represents what a practice would get for 3 months of office visits. The light green is what the revenue they would get for delivering the chemotherapy in the office. The dark green is the profit margin on the drugs. And then the blue is basically the additional $350 a month for 3 months if they selected a regimen that's on pathway. And so you can see how that really actually equalizes the difference in revenue to the practice. In this case, the regimen that's on the right is so expensive, it actually does not offset the higher margin. Most practices would still make more money prescribing that regimen. But lung cancer is a little bit of an extreme situation. In most of the tumor types and scenarios, this has the practice come out a little bit ahead if they're selecting regimens that are on pathway. So I'm happy to answer more questions, but we believe that our program really helps provide value for all stakeholders. It's not really measuring a value, it's about providing value. It supports quality, affordable cancer care. It aligns reimbursement for providers to achieve desired outcomes. And we believe that it really does encourage innovation, because if you as a pharmaceutical, biotech company have really come out with an innovative therapy that improves outcomes, regardless of the cost, honestly, at this point, it makes it onto the pathway. But if you've come out with a Me Too drug that just costs more, you're not going to make it on the pathway. So that's what I have. Thank you.